Okay, Romans chapter 8 for the third time. It's going to be this morning. So we're going to finish up what we talked about, what we started last week, which is the idea of victory, which I don't know that we fully get as Christians. As a matter of fact, I would say that culturally, most of us as Americans don't really get the idea of what it means to be victorious. If we do, maybe we have a skewed view of what it means to truly be victorious. Maybe we would relate victory with winning. And that's really not what victory is, at least as we're looking at it in the biblical sense of the word. So we want to finish that up. And what would you say if I told you I could have you out of here by 11 o'clock this morning? Yeah, that's what I was saying. No, it's not going to happen. I just want to know what you would say if you thought that, okay? So we're going to read verse 37 again to kind of get back to where we were. So Romans 8:37 says, and this is important that we read the whole verse, no, because it starts with no. It doesn't start with in all of these things. So Paul is stating in this verse that what he's previously said, no, don't worry about that. So we'll get into that in a minute. So no, in all of these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. So what is he saying no to? Well, he's saying no to what we talked about last week, and that is all the stuff going on around us. Remember, we talked about nakedness and famine. We talked about peril and the sword. We talked about tribulation and hardship and distress. Those were all the things that are going on around us. And Paul then asked the question, so could any of those things separate us from the love of God? He answers that question by saying, no. None of those things can separate us from the love of God. So if you're going through any of those things, you can be confident in the fact that none of that is going to separate you from the love of God. Not just the love of God, rather the full relationship that is the love of God. See, the love of God is not what we've made it into in America, where we just blanketly say, oh, God loves you. The love of God is not just an emotion God feels towards us. The love of God is the whole aspect of who God is. It's not just that he loves us, it's that he loved us so much that he sent his son to die for us. And he sent his son to die for us so that we could be brought into a relationship with him and ultimately live with him forever and ever. That is the love of God that Paul says we cannot be separated from. So in all of that stuff, we're more than conquerors. Now, I think I said this before we ended last week, and it's important to point out that Paul says no in all of these things. So the idea is, as you are dealing with hardship or persecution or distress, in the middle of your distress, your hardship, and your persecution, you are more than a conqueror. So it's not like, well, I go through this trial and I'm stronger at the end. That's not the idea. As a matter of fact, that hasn't been the idea. Anything we've talked about as we started spiritual warfare, when we talked about standing firm, it wasn't like stand firm and, maybe get through it. It was stand firm through the battle so that in the end you're still standing firm. The idea is the same. So that as you've got trial in your life, you're in the middle of all that. You know what you are in the middle of trial? You're more than a conqueror. And it doesn't matter what it would be. It could be famine-ness. It could be nakedness or famine or peril or sword or distress or trouble or hardship. In everything that's going on. So let me say it this way. Whatever's going on in your life right now, you are more than a conqueror. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if you're on the top of the mountain singing the praises of God. Doesn't matter if you're low in the valley feeling like you've been beat down. In the middle of everything that's going on, you are more than a conqueror. But that phrase, more than a conqueror, kind of stuck out to me. Did anybody else pick up on that? I mean, we know what it means to be a conqueror, right? What does it mean to be more than a conqueror? You ever thought about that? And I have quite a few times. I'm like, well, what does it mean to be more than a conqueror? Because in my mind, if you're the conqueror, that's kind of the top, isn't it? You don't get higher than the conqueror. And yet Paul says, in everything that's going on, we're more than conquerors. So what does it mean to be more than a conqueror? And to think about it, let's use a sports analogy if we could, because ladies, I know how much you love my sports analogies. So I want you to think like that, okay? So you all know, even if you're not a sports fan, you know what Nike is, right? Does anybody not know what Nike is? Okay, Johnny's smiling. Remember I said last week Johnny's rocking those Nike kicks. Got the sparkle slash on or the swoosh on them. So Johnny gets it, I know that. So everybody gets what Nike is, right? So you know that, now some of you may think, no, it's just the brand that you wear. Well, maybe if you're an athlete, Nike is just not the brand you wear. It is the gear that gets you fully prepared to compete in whatever you're doing, right? Gabe, is that kind of the idea? Didn't you have Nike cleats when you were at Indiana Wesleyan? Okay, you had to think about that. It's a tough one there, okay? Yeah, so Nike cleats. So the idea is going to put on my gear, and my gear is going to enable me to compete at a higher level. I mean, isn't that kind of the idea? And I say Nike for a particular reason. Because that could be true, I guess, if Under Armour is your sponsor, or, can't even believe I'm going to say this, Adidas is your sponsor. You know, maybe it could be true that that gear enables you to perform at a level you may not normally perform. Now, again, some of you are like, you just wear Nike because it's the cool stuff to wear, right? But there is this aspect of athletic wear that if you've got the right gear on, you're going to be better prepared to win, okay? So, the word Paul uses, would you believe it if I said it was a version of the word Nike? When Paul says, you're more than a conqueror, he is invoking the name of the shoe company that is actually involved in more than shoes now. He's actually not invoking their name. As a matter of fact, I think they stole the name from someone else. So, the word that Paul uses, when we read the phrase, more than conquerors, is hupronikeo, okay? Now in Greek, that essentially we would translate that as two words. Hupro, we would say is hyper. So what does it mean to be hyper? Does anybody know what it means to be hyper? Okay, what's it mean to be hyper? Overactive is the right word, overactive. That's not the word that's not what I would have said, but yeah, that's a better word than what I would have said, okay? So it means to be overactive. If you're hyper, you're just maybe jittery, you're maybe excited, you can't sit still, you want to walk around. Maybe the way I'm acting right now, could that be considered as hyper? Okay, so you get the idea of what it means to be hyper. So the word hyper, when you couple it with the word we would say as Nike, okay? So the word Nike in Greek, does anybody know what Nike means besides Tyler, who's going to know the answer? Does anybody know what Nike was in Greek? It is the goddess of war. Is it the goddess of war? It's the goddess of war. But we always say God of war, but it is the goddess of war. So in Greek, not just the goddess of war, she is actually the goddess of winning the war. We would call her the goddess of victory. So when Paul uses the term hupronikeo, what he says is that you are engaged in a hyper victory. So what would a hyper victory be? Okay? So let's use the analogy of Piketon versus Waverly, which generally for those of us at Piketon doesn't go real well, okay? It just doesn't. I hate to say that, but that's just the reality of it. So let's say, for example, we have this odd year in which Piketon beats Waverly. Is that a victory? Let's say they win by 1. Who said no? Dora, you out of your mind. Of course that's a victory. So let's say Piketon beats Waverly by 3 points. That's a victory, right? You Waverly people, would you stop it? It's a victory. It's just the way it is. You got beat. Look, and here's the thing. It doesn't happen that often. That's why you're so weirded out by it. But it can happen. It has happened. Just hasn't happened in recent history. And at this point, probably won't happen for another decade or so because we're not playing. So anyway, so you've got the idea of victory. But let's say, for example, Piketon beats Waverly 62-0. Yeah, I know, you're all laughing. I'm just saying. If that happened, that would be a hyper victory, would it not? So the idea is that it's victory, but it is beyond what anybody can comprehend as victory. It is a victory that is so shocking that you're like, that's unbelievable. That's the idea. So when Paul says that you are more than a conqueror, what he's saying is not only do you overcome, not only are you victorious in the trials and hardships and persecution, not only are you victorious, but you are so victorious that people look at you and say, how did that happen? Because that's the way you all experience trials, right? You go through trials and you have so much victory in your life that people look at you and say, wow, how did that happen? No, the answer to that question is no. We typically don't go through trials like that. But that's exactly what Paul says, and I want you to understand that. Paul says that when you're going through all of the stuff that he talked about before, you are experiencing a hyper victory. Now, the reality is that victory, as we understand it, doesn't always mean we get first place. It doesn't always mean we win whatever it is we're trying to do, because the hyper victory that Paul is talking about is going to be a victory that is beyond any worldly victory. And that's where some of us probably would drop out in our understanding of this text. Paul is looking big picture, not immediate reality picture. And that's often the way we want to look. So when we talk about what it means to be more than a conqueror, I want you to understand what Paul says is that you can not only have victory, you can have victory that is over and above what a normal victory is, if you're really committed to serving Jesus. And that is the hang up on this whole thing. So I'm not going to go into a lot more detail because we've talked about a lot of this verse in great detail last week, and I just wanted to kind of wrap that up this morning as we go into the next part and talk about, well, what does it look like then? So if I've got trials, so let me just pause and ask this question. So if you think about your life, I don't want you to raise your hand or shout out and answer it, but as you look at your life and the things that are going on, if you had to figure out, in my life, do I go through more trials and tribulations and persecution and hardships versus victories, or do I experience more victory versus hardship, trial, and persecution? And I'm guessing, and I don't know this, but I'm just guessing based on what I perceive in the culture I live in, that most Americans, most of my friends, most of my co-workers and people who live in my community, they seem to me that they spend most of their time in defeat rather than in victory. Now, that's an observation I've made. I don't know if that's categorically true across the board. I'm just telling you, when I talk to people at work, when I talk to people in my community, there seems to be an attitude of discouragement that seems to predominate everything else in their lives. And so that's why I say we don't understand victory the way Paul did, and because of that, we live lives that are relatively defeated. Primarily because when a pastor says, when I say, you can have a victory that's over and above anything you can imagine. Immediately as Americans, we think, well, that means should make a lot of money. I should have a good job. I should get to retire early. I should be able to live a life that is really quite charmed on this earth and not have any problems. And if that is your idea of victory, then you're not getting what victory is in the New Testament. Now, I would like to add, I believe, and this is my belief, okay, I'm just telling you what I believe. What I believe is that God rewards people who diligently seek Him. I believe with all my heart that if you seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, I believe God rewards people for doing that. But I don't always think God rewards people for doing that by giving them a lot of money or great careers or all the prestige that they want. You see, in America, we seem to be preoccupied with the idea of success is I'm powerful, I'm rich, or I've got a lot of friends. That's the way we perceive success. And anything that doesn't measure up to that, we would say, well, you're not successful, therefore you must not have many victories in your life. That is the wrong way of thinking about victory, at least as we want to understand it. So when we read this verse that says, no, in all of these things, we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. Let me tell you what it clarifies for us about all the stuff that we go through. And look, and I said last week, I don't want to diminish what you go through. Everybody goes through stuff that hurts, right? That's the reality of life. There are times in your lives when you're going to go through hurt and you're going to experience pain. It's a reality of life. There are times in your life when you're going to face hardships, when you're going to face trouble. There may be times, I believe, that in my kid's lifetime, Chaz talked about this in his testimony. See, I believe that in my kid's lifetime, they're going to experience persecution as Christians that I never had to deal with in my lifetime. I'm fully convinced that as a nation, we're headed towards an anti-Christian sentiment that is going to produce persecution that could occur in my kids' lifetime. I really believe that. If not in my kids' lifetimes, than certainly in my grandkids' lifetimes. That's where we're headed in America. We are such an anti-Christian nation right now. That's where we're headed. It's always been, well, I'm not going to say that because I just irritate somebody online, but let me just tell you, that's where I think we're headed. So the idea that I'm not going to experience hardship that has really been hammered into us within American culture, the idea that you can be anything you want to be. Because isn't that what we taught kids as they were growing up? You can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. And I was always the realist saying, no, you can't. I mean, you can't do anything. Really, you can't do anything you want to do. Can you study hard? Absolutely, you can study hard. Can you make a lot of money? Absolutely, you can go out and make a lot of money. There are some things you can do. But you see, some people are more talented than other people. Parents, my generation, we never got that. That's why we created participation trophies, because we couldn't fathom the idea that somehow my kid may not be as good as your kid, and your kid may get a trophy that my kid didn't get, even though he should have gotten it. So we've created this whole culture where we've insulated people from the reality of the world around them. And I'm just telling you, you go through hardships, you go through trials, you go through tribulation. That's just the reality of life. And I don't want to minimize that. Now, look, I will laugh. Well, never mind. I'm not going to say that. I minimize what you go through, because this is what I know. Everybody in their life, you go through things. Maybe someone else looks at it and says, what's the big deal? Just deal with it. But for you, it's not like that. For you, it's a real trial. It's a real tribulation. It's real, and it hurts, and it affects you. So the idea is, so in the middle of that, how do I understand that God really is working for me? How do I understand that in the middle of that, I'm more than a conqueror? So this is how we're going to do that. I want you to know that in the middle of whatever you're going through, this is going to sound absurd on the surface, but if you think about it for a while, I hope it becomes real. Whatever you're going through in your life, as a believer in Jesus Christ, whatever you're going through, you can experience joy in the midst of your trial or your tribulation or your temptation or your failure or your frustration or whatever it is. You can live in a state of joy. And some of you are probably like, are you out of your mind? When I'm going through that, I'm not thinking joy, because really, does anybody, when they go through anything hard, does anybody think this is good for me? Nobody does. You know, nobody goes through something they don't like and says, yeah, I'm glad this is happening to me. I know I'm getting strong. You don't think about that. What you think about is, Lord, how soon is this going to be over? Gabe, how exciting was looking forward to going back to football camp? Did you hear that? That expression was not fun, right? Not some. So every year, Gabe would have to go back a couple weeks early, 3 weeks early, I think, than the rest of the students. And that time was spent in football camp. And football camp was hard, and it was hot, and it was grueling, right? Had to run the conditioning test, and if you didn't pass the conditioning test, you got to get up early before everyone else and run. And then after you'd run all morning, you got to eat breakfast and then go practice all day. And so, did you ever think, man, this is fun, I'm enjoying life? You say, no, I didn't ever enjoy that. So look, when you go through stuff like that, not football camp, because I know most of you probably aren't cut out for football camp, but I'm just saying, when you go through whatever it is in your life, you're like, this stinks, I don't want to be a part of it, I don't want to have to deal with this, your only thinking is, how soon is this going to be over? Is that right? When you're going through, you're like, Lord, when is this going to be done? I'm just treading water here. All I'm trying to do is get to the other side. But I'm saying you can experience joy in the middle of whatever it is you're going through. And when you demonstrate joy in the midst of tribulation, your faith shines like a beacon. See, that's where in America we're not getting this. I ended last week by saying that in the early church, persecution pushed them to revival. So as the early church, as Stephen is killed, as James is put to death, as we're seeing the early church persecuted to the point of death, the early church is growing and growing and growing. Persecution traditionally pushes Christians to revival, but in America it doesn't. It pushes us to run away. Okay? That's the difference today, because we don't want to have to deal with that. We don't get the idea that I could be going through something bad, and not only is it bad, but it is bad, and God seems to be okay with it. See, we experience it. Well, this is what James 1 says. Now, tell me if you've ever heard James 1:2. Brothers, Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Now, if you've ever read that, have you ever thought, James, what in the world is going through your mind? Are you out of your mind? Come on, you've never read that and thought that doesn't make any sense? Because I have. Now, that's verse 2. If you read James chapter 1, verse 1, do you know who James is writing this letter to? He is writing to the 12 tribes, which are what? Scattered abroad. You know why they're scattered abroad? Because we call it the dysphoria. Persecution. So we're writing to Christian Jews in the early church who were pushed out of their homeland by persecution. So they get it. Don't think for a second, don't think for a second, James, who is the brother of Jesus, don't think for a second he doesn't get what's going on. James is writing to a group of people who have been pushed out of their homeland by persecution. You know, I was thinking about that. If somebody comes along and says, hey, Brian, you need to give up your homeland. You need to give up your home. Because let me talk specifically about the little piece of land I own on Smoky Hollow Road. You know how I'm going to give up that land if someone ever tries to take it from me? When they take the deed from my cold dead body. I mean, but isn't that the Pike County way, Rick? Do you get that? That's Pike County way, right? You're going to take away my homeland. I'm gonna die defending it. That's my attitude. That's my mentality. That's an American mentality, I think. I don't know that many people are willing to do that, but look, that's just how connected I am with my homeland, with the place I live. Here are Jews, and really, look, if someone comes and takes my land, I'm going to be irritated about it. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to spend the rest of my life thinking, I was cheated, I was wronged, it's not fair. God, how could you let this injustice stand? It's not right. Why don't you give me back what's rightfully mine? That's probably the way I would spend my time. Is that what we see going on when James writes to his brothers and says, hey, brothers that have been pushed from your home, that are now scattered abroad, I want you all to count it pure joy when you fall into various trials. And for us as Americans, and we're like, are you kidding me? That makes no sense at all. No one in their right mind goes through tribulation and thinks that it's a good thing. Now, Job, our friend from the Old Testament, Job gives us great perspective on how you deal with suffering, does he not? Now, I'm not saying he gives us the right perspective on how you deal with suffering, but he gives us perspective on how you deal with suffering. And really, Job does it in a way that I get, because Job would make the argument, well, this really doesn't seem fair. Matter of fact, he's going to make that argument to God at one point. He's going to say, it really doesn't seem fair. I mean, where were you when all this stuff was going on? And that's when God says, okay, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I drew Leviathan? Can you draw the Leviathan out? Well, I can. So, Job, you got all these questions you want answered. Answer me like a man. That's what he says to Job. But Job, at one point, as he is defending his actions, because, look, Job was a guy that was beat up. I know he was. It would be miserable. Look, he lost everything. Everything. He lost his kids. At one point, we see this, I don't want to say alienation. There's tension between him and his wife. It's a bad deal. And then, just when you're like, oh, it can't get any worse, then he gets boils on the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, and he sits down and he scrapes his body with broken pieces of pottery. That's a miserable guy right there. And so at one point, as Job is going through all that, in chapter 13, verse 15, and I love this. This is what he says. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. You pick up on what Job is saying. Even if God chooses to take my life, I am still going to trust in him. Then, this is what he says in verse 16, which is the very next verse. He says, this will turn out for my salvation. This will turn out for my salvation. Actually, my NIV says deliverance. King James said salvation. I like deliverance better, but the idea is this, whatever's going on, God's going to come through. That's the confidence that he has. I know what I'm going through hurts. I know what I'm going through is painful and I don't want to deal with it. What I believe in the middle of everything that's going on is that God is going to come through for me. Because we need to believe that in this world we're going to have tribulation. Look, Jesus made it a point to specifically say to his followers, in this world, you're going to have tribulation. Guys, you're going to suffer. Some of them even are going to die very quickly after Jesus' resurrection. So So you're going to have tribulation in this world. And then the way I learned as a kid, in this world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. And that phrase, be of good cheer, always sounded kind of odd to me because I'm reading it thinking, be of good cheer means to be happy, right? It means kind of like, I want to be good with this, right? Somebody at least say yes or no, or I don't get that. I mean, that's what I thought when I was growing up. Be of good cheer means I'm going to have tribulation. Be happy about it. So the word actually means, the phrase be of good cheer, one word in Greek, the word actually means confident and to be bold, kind of at the same time. So it's this word we put together that means be bold and confident. The idea is stand firm and you get through it. Not necessarily be happy about it, because that's not what Jesus said, but stand firm. Now, why in the world would I be confident in the middle of a trial, so much so that it can produce joy in my life? Because that's the idea we're developing here. If we're going to count it joy, or if we're going to think, God, this is bad, but with you it's good. If we're going to have that perspective on the things we go through, how do we arrive at that point? I mean, how in the world can anyone be joyous or confident when they're going through the middle of something that they really don't want to have to deal with? This is how we do it. So if you're like, hey, Brian, I hear what you're saying. I'm just telling you, it sounds stupid because I do not have joy. And quite honestly, I don't know that I want to have joy in the middle of my trials. But the Bible very clearly says when you go through these sufferings, and look, Jesus, all the stuff we talked about last week, Jesus explicitly dealt with all of that. Jesus said, he talked about nakedness, he talked about famine. Jesus would say it this way, don't worry about what you're going to eat, don't worry about what you're going to wear. So Jesus dealt with famine and nakedness, he dealt with persecution and tribulation, he dealt with the hardships of life. Jesus dealt with it this way. If someone would sue you at the law and take away your coat, you know what you should do? Give them your cloak also. See, that is so out of step with what we think as Christians today in America. Jesus says if you are compelled to walk a mile, you know what you should do? You should voluntarily walk an extra mile. See, look, as Americans, we don't even want to drive a mile unless the air conditioning's on right now, right? Let alone walk a mile and carry a soldier's gear. We're not going to do that. You mean volunteer and go another? Yeah, that's what he said. Jesus said, this is so hard for me to get my mind around, but I'm telling you, this is what Jesus said. Jesus said if someone slaps you on the right cheek, what are you supposed to do? No one wants to say it, right? You're supposed to turn the other cheek. That's where that expression comes from. It means, okay, hit me again. Now, when you read that, you're like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. No, Jesus understood trials and temptations. He understood everything we go through. And Jesus says, so my disciples, as you go through this is the way I want you to respond to these trials. This is how you respond to them. And if you respond to them, you know what you're going to have? Joy. That could be part of the issue we have in American culture with why we don't experience joy when we go through trials. Someone slaps you, what do you generally have the instinct to do? Slap them back. I mean, that's just natural, right? Do you have to think about that? Do you have to think about that? Or does it just instinctively come out of you? Look, it instinctively comes out of you, right? Unless they're bigger than you, then you're like, you better not do that again. And then you walk away, right? That's the way you handle that. So there's this thing in us that instinctively says, you hit me, I'm going to hit you. You take my coat, I'm going to take something from you. You make me walk a mile, I'm going to make that the most miserable mile of your life. I mean, that's the way we think, and that's not what Jesus said. So the idea that we can experience joy in the middle of all the stuff that's going on around us, it's hard for us to get. And so how do we get to that point where we look at what's going on and say, God, man, this really stinks right now, but what I want to do is I want to serve you. Because we need to understand that you can serve God in the middle of tribulation, in the middle of trials, in the middle of hardship, in the middle of persecution, in the middle of trouble, in the middle of whatever's going on in your life. You can still serve God. And not only can you serve God, you can do it in a joyful way. But we understand something the world doesn't. And this is what separates us. Paul says in Philippians 1 that he who began a good work in us will see it through until the day of Jesus Christ. That God, who began this process of transformation in our lives, is not going to stop until it comes to fruition. So well, we'll get into that later. Let me just tell you that if you've been born again and you know Jesus, what God is doing in your life is not to hurt you or to keep you down. It's not to discourage you. It is to build you up and strengthen you so that on the day when you meet His Son face to face, you will be fully mature in the kingdom of God. Now, if you think about it that way, it ought to give you a different perspective. So what we're thinking now, we're not thinking in terms of, okay, I'm going to win this battle. Because see, when we started spiritual warfare a few months ago, the idea was, I got to win the battle. We're not thinking so much about winning the battle as we are winning the war. There's a difference between the battle and the war, right? So the battles are what we fight here on this earth. The war is what has already been won through the shed blood of Jesus. We win the war. So we are more than conquerors, and as we're going through trials and tribulation, we do it with joy. Not because we think this is really good. This is what we understand. What we're going through here right now, in this moment in time, according to the Bible, you know how the Bible describes these troubles that we go through right now? It describes them as light, which we would never agree with, right? And momentary. So, number 2 this morning, what we're going through right now is temporary and compared with eternity is easy. Now, notice I didn't say what you're going through is easy. And I don't want anybody to say, what an idiot. You don't know what I'm going through. It's not easy. No, I'm not saying it's easy. This is what I said. What you're going through now, when compared with eternity, is easy. Now, this is the way the New Testament would say it. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all." So what we go through here is real. And again, I do not want to minimize anything that anybody goes through. But what you're going through here now, Paul says very clearly, is light compared to eternity, and it's momentary. Look, this tribulation, this trouble, the trials, the hardships, do they last forever? No, it may seem like they last a long time, but they don't last forever. They're temporary. And so we know in the New Testament what we go through, yeah, we deal with it here, and it stinks that we got to deal with it, but what we know is that there's going to be victory on the other side. We know that, and we believe that because we're confident in God. We know there's going to be victory, but it's that moment when we're in the trial or the tribulation or wherever it is, it's in that moment where our faith really begins to wane, isn't it? And we begin to think, God, are you serious? I mean, this is what you want me to go through? This is your process for growth in my life? Is that I go through things that are uncomfortable? Now, for those of you that raised kids, did your kids have to go through things that were uncomfortable to deal with? Mine did. I mean, that's just the reality of life. Sometimes, in the course of their growth, part of their uncomfort was directly the result of what I did. Just was. Because as a good dad, you know what I want to make sure? I want to make sure that as my kids grow up, they are fully prepared for adulthood. So there were times, I'm going to say this, it's going to be put online, and children's services are going to show up at my house today. And I'm hoping the statute of limitations has already expired. But there were times when my kids were growing up when they got spanked, sometimes kind of hard. And the purpose of that spanking, Lexi, what was it for? Just because I was mad and needed to blow off some steam? Yeah. I knew she was going to say that. To teach you, she said that after she said the other part. That's the reality of life. So you parents, I hope you can identify with that. That there are times in my kids' development when they got punished for what they did, and the idea of punishment was to make them better than what they are. Now, I will be honest with you, I never made the statement, this is going to hurt me worse than it hurts you, because that's not even true, is it? No, that's a laughable statement. Every time I spank my kids, I'm thinking in the back of my head, this is going to hurt really bad, and it's not going to hurt me at all, okay? It's just the reality of a whooping when you're growing up. Matter of fact, I told Rhonda the other day, I hope my mom doesn't watch this. So I remember I got spanked a lot when I was growing up because I was a kid who honestly deserved to get a lot of the whoopings that I got. That's just the reality of life. And so Lexi, were you surprised by that? No. You got a shocked look on your face. Okay, you shouldn't be surprised by that. But I remember this one time my mom was giving me a whipping. So for my mom, it was first available, whatever you can get your hands on, right? Sometimes I committed troubles as a kid where there was nothing readily available. So you know what she spanked me with? Her hand. Did you ever get spanked with your hand? And my mom was spanking me, and she broke a blood vessel in her hand. And when it started to bruise, I got another whipping because I broke a blood vessel in her hand. And I remember I was telling Rhonda that the other day. That was like pretty normal for me. Not normal for my kids, though, to anybody in social services that would be watching. That did not happen with my kids, okay? So look, we go through things in life, our kids do things in life that we know are going to hurt, that we know we don't want them to go through, but as good parents, you know what we do? We step back and we say, look, it kills me to watch you go through this, but what I know is that you're going to be better than what you would be if you didn't go through it. So what we go through, God sees what we're going through. Look, don't think for a second this morning that what you're going through, God's somehow forgotten about or doesn't know about. Not only does He know about it, He's right there in the middle of it with you. See, He hasn't forsaken you. He hasn't walked away. He hasn't said, oh, you messed up. You deal with this on your own. God is with you in the middle of everything that's going on. What God understands is that what you're going through now, compared to what He's doing in your life, is light and it is momentary. Now, see, we've got to change our perspective to fully get that. When we talk about what we're going through now as light, you need to think about the alternative. So, and I'm going to say this pretty plainly. So when you think of like the trouble you go through now, so when you think of maybe you're going through a hardship that has just broken you down, maybe physically or mentally or emotionally or whatever, and you're beaten down and you're like, you know what, this Christianity, it's not even worth it. I'm not going to put up with this. I just can't do this anymore. Okay? And you say, I'm going to give up and walk away. Compare that to an eternity without Jesus. And think about which suffering is going to be worse. An eternity without Jesus is a far worse suffering than what you go through here. Likewise, as a believer, you're going through something, you're like, God, I don't like this, I don't want to do this, but I love you and I'm committed to you, and I will endure whatever I have to go through because I believe that the suffering I'm enduring now is producing something in me that someday in eternity it's going to outweigh everything I ever experienced here. And for those of us that really know Jesus, we fall. What I believe is that in this life we're going to have problems. But there is coming a day when we're not going to have problems anymore. Everything that we've dealt with here will not even be a forgotten memory in our minds. That old mind will be wiped away and everything is going to become new. And there is going to be no more pain. There is going to be no more suffering. We're going to a place where there's going to be no more death. That's better than what we're going through now. And if we are faithful, that's our goal. So when you look at like what's going on now, you're like, God, this stinks, I don't want to do it, but I'm committed to you because I want to go to heaven. That is how we come to the realization that our light and our temporary troubles are producing something in us that outweighs everything else. And we get that perspective. Thirdly, and I said this last week, I think I've said this for a couple weeks. Jesus living in you is greater than your adversary who is in the world. You see, this is the world we live in. And so when we talk about spiritual warfare, we talked about this, I'll bring it up just for a minute. The world we live in, we deal with the spiritual consequences in a material world, okay? So we deal with troubles and trials because we have an adversary who is always looking for a way to beat us down. It's just the world we live in. You have an adversary. Your adversary is working against you, and his objective is to steal, kill, and destroy. That's what he wants to do with everything in your life. So when you have Jesus in you, Jesus is greater than the one who is in the world. Or this is the way 1 John says it. You, dear children, are from God and have overcome them. Now, the them in 1 John 4 are the children who possess the spirit of Antichrist. So literally what he says, you, dear children, are from God and have overcome those in the world, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. Listen, the God who lives in us has the power to say, let there be light, and there's light. The God who lives in us has the power to think about Mary and Martha and their friends standing outside the tomb of their dead brother. Think about that scene. Jesus has the ability to say, Lazarus, come forth. And the dead man gets up after 4 days and walks out of the tomb. The power of Jesus in us is greater than any power in the world. That's what makes us overcomers. That's what makes us more than conquerors. The one who is in us is greater than the one who is in the world. And we're going to end with this one because I know it's getting late. Romans, this comes from Romans 8, and if you want to back up, it's verse 28. This is something that we need to get our minds around and understand in a really deep way, because we are fully convinced. Paul says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So God is in your life actively working all things for His good. Now, not always a big fan of the way the NIV translates this, but we'll go with it this morning. The idea is stuff happens in your life. The King James says, for we know, the King James says, for we know in all things God works together for good. I like that better because the idea is not that God causes everything, rather that God uses everything. See, we have an adversary. I said that already. So you have an adversary who is going to inject into your life trials and tribulations. That's what he's going to do. God's not doing that, but your adversary is doing that. So when your adversary injects into your life trials and tribulations and hardship and trouble, God is going to take that bad thing and use it for good. That's what this verse means. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to His purpose. So God takes all the junk that comes into your life that the devil wants to inject, and He causes it to work for good. So the devil can come to you and say, you know what? I'm going to give you a miserable day today. I'm starting a new job on Tuesday. And I'm telling you, I'm a little stressed about it. I don't know if stressed is the right word. I'm anxious. I'm worried. You know, you ever do that where you're like, what if I mess this up? Man, I've kind of hung my hat on this. And if I mess it up, then guess what I am? Unemployed. And I don't want to be unemployed. So let's say my adversary, I hope I'm not giving him ideas right now. Oh, he's not allowed in here, so he can't hear this anyways. So let's say my adversary is thinking, you know what? Brian's already kind of anxious about his first day on Tuesday, so I think I'm going to poke a hole in his tire halfway to Hillsboro so he's late for class. Now, would that be incredibly irritating? Look, I'm just telling you, if that happens, for the record, I'm going to be checking my tires now every 45 minutes until Tuesday morning. So let's say that happens, and I'm on my way for my first day for my new job, and I'm excited. Things are going good, a little anxious, but I know God's got this. And as I'm driving along, I get a flat tire. The first thing I'm going to think is, God, where in the world are you? Why did you let me get a flat tire? It doesn't seem fair. I already got enough stuff going on in my head right now that you couldn't. I mean, it's a flat tire. I can fix a flat tire. You mean you can't supernaturally just put your finger in it and not let the tire go down? Why don't you do some of that God stuff and really impress me right now? Or does nobody else think like that? You don't think like that? That's what I think all the time. Anytime something like this happens, I'm like, God, why don't you just fix that? You can do that. If I say my prayer the right way, aren't you supposed to be the genie that pops out of the bottle and goes like that? And everything then suddenly gets fixed the way it should? Aren't you that God? No. Look, those things happen in life. This is what I know. If I have a flat tire, and look, are you all like wondering next Sunday when I come and preach if I'm going to talk about car trouble? So this is what I know, that if that occurs, I'm going to be frustrated. I'm just telling you right now. I'm already thinking about it in my head. Be frustrated. If anything happens on the way to my new job on Tuesday morning, I'm going to be irritated immediately, even though I know God's got it under control. Now, why is that? You ever wonder why that is? What is it in our fallen DNA that just instinctively thinks it's all falling apart? God, where are you when I need you? Because that's what we think, right? This is a mess. So what Paul says is that we have the confidence. I don't know that we always know it, but we have the confidence. This is where our faith becomes real. We know in all things that God is working together. God is using them. God is turning events so that what the enemy meant for evil, God uses it for good. That's what goes on in our lives. And so look, victory is not about winning. I want you to get that idea out of your head, because that is the American Christian idea of what it means to be victorious. Victory says you are the winner and you beat everyone else. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something much deeper than that. What we're talking about, when we talk about being more than conquerors, we talk about having victory in Jesus. We're talking about the reality that someday, when all of this stuff down here is gone, we're going to be with the Lord forever and ever. That's victory. I found this old hymn. I don't even know how old this hymn is. What I know is I've never heard it, but I would like to have heard it. This is the first verse. Hallelujah, I am free. Jesus gives me victory. Glory, glory, hallelujah. He is all in all to me. Shout your freedom everywhere. His eternal peace declare. Let us sing it here below in the face of every foe. We will sing it on that shore when this fleeting life is o'er. Sing it here, you ransomed throng. Start the everlasting song. Isn't that great? I love that. I've never heard that song in my life until I just found it a couple weeks ago. This is what the chorus says. I am trusting in the Lord. I am standing on his word. I have peace and joy within since my life is free from sin. Victory, victory, victory. I'm like, that's an awesome song. But that song conveys the reality of what we're really talking about. You see, winning is not, I beat you, because that's what victory is for most of us. I beat you. Piketon beat Waverly, or Waverly beat Piketon, and that's victory. That's not the victory we're talking about. The victory we're talking about is a bigger victory than that. And I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. Paul, I think in chapter 14 or 15, says, there is coming a day in which our mortality is going to put on immortality. And our corruptible is going to put on incorruptible. Then, he says, will be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. And then, he actually quotes Hosea, and I can see him writing this as a taunt, because what he says is, death, what are you going to do now? This is what he says. He's quoting from Hosea. Death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? They have no victory. But you know who wins? We win. Because the final enemy that had to be defeated in our lives has been defeated. And then Paul goes on to say, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through Jesus Christ our Lord. We experience victory, not the way the world does. If you're here this morning, you're thinking, well, Brian, so you're telling me I can be successful in life if I believe in Jesus. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. So, Brian, you're telling me that if I believe in Jesus, then it'll fix my marriage. It'll fix my problem at work. I'll get that promotion I've been looking at. You're telling me that I'll have success. No, that's not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is this. If you want to experience victory in this world, you cannot experience it apart from Jesus Christ. Everything without him is loss. Everything. Paul says, this is why Paul actually says that. Paul says, I take everything that I've ever had and known, and I count it as loss for the all-surpassing knowledge of knowing Jesus is my Lord. That, my friends, is victory, and that's why Jesus died for us, so we could experience victory in life. Now, the really awesome thing is, when you believe in Jesus, when you serve Jesus, that will translate into things, I got to be very careful with this, that will translate into this world in a real way. And I'm not telling you you'll get that promotion, or your marriage is going to be saved, or you're going to get whatever it may be. I'm not telling you that. What I'm telling you is, if you want to experience joy and satisfaction and victory on this earth, you will never experience it apart from Jesus Christ. And the longer you live without Him, the more you experience failure and defeat. That will someday culminate in an eternal separation from Him, where you will experience defeat in a way that you don't even and can't even comprehend it now. See, for those of us who believe in Jesus, we're going to a place where our victory is going to be rewarded forever and ever. But there are also people who reject Jesus, and they're going to a place where their defeat will be played over in punishment for eternity from here on out. That's the reality of life. I want to give you an opportunity this morning to experience victory, real victory. Not like, hey, can our team win and when we play this team again? No, that's not what I'm talking about. If you really want to experience victory in your life, what you need to do is you need to surrender your life to Jesus Christ. And then and only then will you know what it means to be victorious. Bow your heads with me.